Hello everybody, good to be with you today. My name is Jim Harris. I've been in South Africa for about 10 days, 2 weeks almost actually, living and working in Kenya. Bit more by way of background. UK born and raised till I was 24, called by God to work in what we then called the third world. Thought I'd be doing agriculture, switched to Bible teaching. So I was in Zambia initially, and then I've been in Kenya, basically in the same village, since 1993. So this is not a Bible study, but I do want to open with scripture, which is John chapter 6 verse 15, which says the following: Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Seems Jesus didn't want to be a king-like person. Now, a king-like in certain ways, yes, but not king-like in the way that people wanted to make him to be. So when he feared that people were going to make him into a king, he scuppered. What was going on? John chapter 6 is a fascinating chapter. Jesus was trying to teach something deep and profound, that those who ate of his body and drunk of his blood would be saved from their sins. And that could extend to thousands of people. He began with a demonstration by which he fed people with fish and bread. This wasn't a model for ministry, we discover later, but it was to have been understood by people as indicating that his body given up for us would be sufficient for everybody. People misunderstood, thought he was about distributing bread. Perhaps we run into a similar hazard these days. We do missionary work using a lot of resources or things that entice people into what we want to tell them, to listen to what we want to tell them, money or resources. Now, I'm from East Africa. East Africa, of course, is very different from South Africa. So forgive me if I say things that are perhaps considered inappropriate in South Africa. I'm using English. I don't like using English speaking with Africans because in many ways I just don't think it's helpful. Using English, you can't say the things you would like to say. You end up saying things that many African people don't really understand. And although they may know English, it's very clear to me that African people's English that's rooted in their own languages and understanding is vastly different in terms of its interaction with its context than British English. Yet, of course, we're in a very difficult catch-22, where English these days, with the spread of the internet, is increasingly essential, but foundationally destructive. In simple terms, let's say, how can Africans who imitate the English of Westerners resolve issues that they face that Westerners don't face? Well, in fact, if you imitate the English of outsiders, you'll end up like solving their problems, and those issues or concerns or problems that are peculiar to your people and that are not shared with those other people will disappear. Well, they'll disappear in terms of the English discourse, they won't disappear in terms of actuality. So use of English prevents us effectively engaging with African ways of life. You can say much about this. Let me just say, perhaps languages between Africa and the West are as different as are different languages of sports. Let's take, for example, football and tennis. So if the cultures of Africa against the culture of the West are as different as a game of soccer or football is from the game of tennis, then we should realize there are some issues when one language is used that occludes translation. For example, if I say, what is a free kick in tennis? So if you have to translate from soccer speak to tennis speak, what would you say is a free kick? I guess you'd say a serve. Rather different things. What is offside in tennis? Maybe it's being too far from the net. What is a net in tennis? Remember, the net in football is the place you want to get the ball into, whereas a net in tennis is the place you want to get the ball over. If you want to come back to this comparison, let me know later. Some background to remember. The West closes its eyes to anything that will credit Christianity. Something to remember. In other words, the dominant media, the dominant discourse in our world today, the globalizing discourse, outside of specifically Christian contexts, but that affects even Christian contexts, on principle, does not want to credit Christianity, because if they do, that will undermine their secular liberal way of thinking, which they think should deal with everything that needs to be dealt with in human community. So let's not be surprised when Christian discourse is discredited. It may not be being discredited because it's worthy of being discredited, but it might be being discredited because people don't want it, because its acceptability would undermine deep values which are faltered but which they want to hold to. Also want to draw attention to the fact that Western thinking is dualistic. Dualistic, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean something like this. According to native English discourse, there is the natural and the supernatural. So these days we say the natural, the world is like a clock, it's like a machine that kind of keeps ticking over. And then in the Western conception of Christianity, there's a supernatural, there's a God who comes and does something in that ticking over world. Now you could look at this in different ways, but foundationally I suggest that model isn't very African at all, because in African ways of understanding, God is really a part of everything and really determines everything. Now, not that then therefore African people can't recognize natural events, but yet as soon as a natural event becomes significant, then the role of God in it, whoever God is considered to be very consequential. Now, it may well be desirable for Africa or African people to acquire some dualism. Now, in order to acquire dualism as something that they don't have, they really need to know who they are, non-dualistic, as in order to acquire this other feature. And that's what I say is so difficult these days, because the globalized world doesn't want to recognize African people for who they are, through fear that they would find them to be different from, say, Europeans, and that difference might have been brought about by the Christian faith, which would then require the globalized world to emphasize more on evangelism into Christianity than into rationality, economics, and political science, and all these other things. So the dualism in the West tends not to be grasped by African folks. Now that has many implications. Let's just look at one of those. Salvation in African thinking has to be physical as well as spiritual. Now there's a widespread notion in the West that Jesus comes to deal with the spiritual. So you can be, you're being saved, becoming a Christian or Jesus follower doesn't necessarily in Western thinking affect your economic thriving. They're two different things. So you can be going to your job and doing your work and earning your salary and buying your house and running your car in a certain way, and when you become a Christian that doesn't necessarily change. Whereas in the African way of thinking, in which the two are one, it's very hard to separate the concept of salvation from the concept of healing. And of course healing in the African way of thinking is not biochemical healing as it's considered to be in the West, but it's everything, like being more alive. Healing is what makes you more alive. And thirdly, just to say that it seems to me that these days treating African people like Africans, or even describing African people as if they're African, is essentially illegal. Why is it illegal? Well, because they're not supposed to be any different from Westerners, and if you suggest that they are, you very quickly get accused of being racist. But yet, as I say, if we don't take note of differences, then how can we adapt theology for African contexts, and how can African people build on their own thinking without being faulted every time their own thinking is different from Western thinking? What I'd like to suggest is that missionaries ought to be breaking the mold on some of these things, or at least some missionaries. Why missionaries? Well, missionaries like sent from the West are in a strong position. They're supported. They don't have to do menial work to raise the money that takes many hours in the day. They have time available to minister. They're informed about the West, which is dominating the world in a way that many African folks are not. So insofar as it's true that, and I think there's a large extent it is the case, that Europe is kind of in its thinking, its activities kind of envelop the world into its own particular strategies and cause problems for Africa. Missionaries are those who can become aware of how that happens. Now, if at the same time then they become familiar with an African language, that will enable them also to grasp something about Africa and to critically consider the relationship between the two, the Western understanding of Africa, the truth of Africa, so as to be able to communicate the gospel effectively into that meeting of cultures. I also secondly want to suggest that some missionaries these days cease from seeing a key part of their role as bringing resources to Africa from the West. Now, why do I say this? Well, for many reasons, more of which I'll look at. Let's say it at this point. Why buy all your friends? If you have friends who you meet, but they're not dependent on you, they can be honest to you, even and criticize you honestly. If as soon as your friend tells you their problem, you give them the money to solve it, they come to be a client rather than a friend. And one problem with clients is, in order to maintain the flow of money, they tend to say what's pleasing rather than necessarily what's true. So some missionaries ought to use African languages to break the mold, and some also ought to use indigenous resources so as to be attentive to what people are actually saying and hearing and thinking. Okay, this took a bit more about myself. I was born and raised in the UK, as I said, called by God in the mid-80s, say, to serve him in the third world. But for a long time I said, no, I just don't have the aptitude or the skills for that kind of thing. But I guess God kept pressing until in 1987 I conceded my life to service in the third world for life. Now, there are a lot of people in those days coming from Europe and doing short term, but to me that didn't make sense. I mean, if you want to serve God and he gives you a difficult year at the beginning, does that mean that he actually doesn't want you to serve him? Well, that's kind of putting God to the test, if ever anything is. So to me, I had to give my life in service or nothing at all. I didn't see the point in short-term missions. So that's what I did in 1987, not to any mission agency because that's difficult, but before the Lord, let's say. So from the beginning, when I came to Zambia in 1988, I've been committed on that basis. Now let me tell you some of the things that happened when I came to Zambia. It's like people didn't know I was coming. There was no housing for me, but there was a Zambian who was living by himself in a large house. So they said, well, put him in one of those rooms, a 3-bedroom house. So I stayed with this Zambian, which wasn't usually policy for missions. What I found with this Zambian called Goliath, because we were staying together, of course, we go hither and thither together at different times. And now, by the way, he walked incredibly slowly, which was very difficult for me. But anyway, I had to get used to walking slowly as he did. Now, one time walking with him and having noted his behavior somewhat, and in other words, although he was friendly with whites, he tended to excuse himself rather than spending a lot of time with whites. I asked him why that was. And he said something like this: the more people see me with whites, the more they will understand that I'm really wanting money. In other words, in that African community, the reputation of white people is that missionaries, these are all missionaries who are around, they were kind of preoccupied with money and with helping people with money. And this really knocked me back. I thought, well, do I want African people to fear coming close to me? Because when they're seen with me, they'll be ruining their reputation amongst other people. No, I don't want to fear that. So I'm not going to build my relationships with African people on the back of money. I want to build it on the back of, well, how we normally relate with people, being a friend, enjoying one another's company, things like that. Now, related to that, I was doing agriculture at the time, and all these ideas came to my mind as to projects that I might engage. But as these ideas were coming in, I was kind of probing what might be the best strategy, way forward for agriculture so that people could have more food. I realized something quite profoundly difficult, which is that all my great ideas basically needed money from outside in order to work. And almost invariably, if you look at the economic equation of the people who I was interacting with there in rural Zambia, all my proposals, they would say yes to, because even if things didn't work the way I thought they would, they were still going to get money out of that. Add to that the fact that if I proposed a project to a certain community and they refused, then I might go to another community, they'd get the money. So the first community who were honest to say, look, this won't work, Jim, are going to be kind of ashamed or laughed at or mocked because someone else said, yes, that'll work, that's wonderful, do that. So if I was to follow the route of having resources to give to people in order to run projects, then I would no longer be able to ascertain what is truthful. I was struck in Zambia, and I said I was living with a Zambian, and that seemed to be quite extraordinary. I think some of the missionaries were a bit upset at that situation. But that did add to my puzzlement as to why we always have to live so separately. And that is the pattern. I mean, you kind of work together, though nothing like as close as I thought I would find Africans and Westerners working together when I first got to Zambia. But I thought, why can't a Western actually live with Zambians? Use their language, or Africans, who rear children in their way, not standing aside and looking from a distance and telling them what to do or not to do, but to actually be a part of that African community. Now that challenge I then implemented. In due course, I came back to Kenya, not Zambia, for various reasons, and having been in Kenya since 1993, I landed in a village. I didn't come to a mission station or even to a town. And the people who I began relating to in the village then, some of them, that's 31 years ago, good number are no longer around, but that gave me a foundation that continues to keep me living in the village. My home is a typical village home. My home languages are Luo, that's the language of Barack Obama, and Swahili. I look after orphan children in that home, which is not like a Western home or missionary home. It's like a local home as far as possible. So being in the village, in a normal village house, as I say, in fact 29 years old, but a little bit like a boy in the home initially, I had to learn things like how to welcome guests. Now, if a guest comes to your door in the UK, often what you do, go and open the door, yes, what do you want? In the African context, if you treat people that way, you're offending them greatly. They just walk into your house. I had to learn that. My own thought of rearing children is that it's fun to kind of be in the same space. Remember at one point I was talking with my pastor, African pastor, and the children were within earshot, and lady said to him, "You children were making too much noise when older people were talking. When old people are talking, you make sure you're out of the way so you don't disturb them." Now this is kind of shocking to me, but I said, well, if this is the African way, that's what I need to do. But I need to know that in order to be able to do it, and I need to learn it. How do I learn it? Except by living in that African space. I also learned that if I was going to use the Luo language, I had to always use it. I couldn't choose this person I'm going to speak to in English and that person in Luo, because if I do that, then, you look at someone, you say, is this person intelligent? Yes, let's speak to them in English. Is that person non-intelligent? Let's speak to them in Luo. You're judging everybody. You can't sustain that. So once one begins using an African language, one has to use it with everybody, because English is so much like gold dust. I learned you had to be very careful helping widows. Now, different points, many widows have come to my home and they've come to see me, and they've told me their issue. Their husband died 2 years ago, they have 4 children, they don't have enough food, don't have enough money, and so on. Now it rends my heart, really grips my heart to say, I really want to help this widow. Now, what if I do? So let's say I give this widow $100 because she seems to be in a difficult situation. 2 days later, another widow comes, tells me about her situation. I give her $10. The widows talk. Oh, Jim obviously likes you. I'm getting myself very quickly into deep trouble, which made me realize that I cannot, as an ignorant outside visitor, go around helping people who ask me for money and resources, because you can't be fair to everybody, and my lack of knowledge especially would make that very risky. Okay, we set up an extension Bible teaching program that lasted for 18 years, in which I kind of implemented the things that the West was telling me Africans wanted, and the Africans said the same. We go somewhere, we want to open a Bible class. Yes, we really want to know God's Word. So we go and open a class. First day we'd have maybe 20 people, or they might just come 10 minutes late. And then a week later, the second class, there were 12 people. A little bit later, 3 weeks later, there'd be 2 people, and they're coming half an hour late. 2 months later, the class would close. And sometimes people were courageous enough to be honest to me and say, Jim, you need to provide some money. We're not going to come to your classes if all you do is teach us. We want some money. Like I say, African people are holistic. They want always the spiritual with the material. And those are for them inseparable, even though for us they're not. I taught in an international school up to degree level in English, theology, Bible and theology for many years, part-time. As the years went by, as my Swahili improved, it became more and more difficult to be serious about teaching these students in English, because I realized what their understanding was and how using Swahili I could articulate, I could communicate theology much more to their context. Now, this was frustrating for the students because they knew the way forward was English, and they also knew that what was important for them was not to have a white person come and tell them how to adapt theology to their context. It was to know theology as Americans know it, to get that degree, and subsequently to get a paying job, and maybe even to go to America. So rather than my seeking to make theology relevant to them being an asset, it was a problem for the students, and they were not always very impressed. with myself, despite my efforts at learning the languages. In fact, rather in some ways I didn't learn the languages and just say things as I would have done in the UK, and that would have got them the best credit. And for many people, that of course is how they operate, because they kind of end up with no choice. But some who do operate that way are wise enough to realize that a missionary who uses only local languages and only local resources can perceive things that those using English and donor money can't perceive, and can work in ways and relate to people with a vulnerability that a donor using outside languages can't match. Now, for example, the one thing that I find myself very much aware of, maybe constantly, is people's fear of envy. Again, this is not the kind of thing you'll find in a book, unless I've written a book. But what I've found in intercultural relationships, interacting with the people I'm with in Kenya, is that their discourse is organized in such a way as to avoid creating contrasts that could provoke envy. So, for example, you don't go and ask people how many cows, someone asks how many cows he's got, because if you do, it's implying maybe you want to steal them, maybe you're envious of him, or if you have 10 cows and he only has one, maybe you're going to laugh at him. So people won't give you an honest answer either. Similarly, how are your kids doing? Now you can ask that question, but if you follow up very much, and let's say your children are all at university and he's got labouring jobs, again, you're provoking his envy. Why do you want him to remind him that your children are at university and his are not? Or it's the other way around, and you're asking, how's your child doing at university? It's like you're finding out that information that will sharpen your envy against that person. So conversations are limited. Truth is really something to be concealed rather than expressed, in order to avoid provoking envy or demonstrating envy. And here one can add, envy is a powerhouse of witchcraft. So effectively, bewitching people and witchcraft arises from envy. So going back to John 6:15, Jesus was actually saying in John 6:15, you have to eat my body and drink my blood. Now this was a hard message for people to take on board, and many left him, we're told later in the chapter. But that is Jesus' message. Jesus' message isn't here's money for everybody or there's food for everybody, and neither is Jesus' message I have a better language. Jesus' message is eat my body, drink my blood. Now I'm not going to try and expound on the whys and wherefores of eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood, but to say that in order to promote that message, we need to distance ourselves from donor models, and we need to be able to hear what people are saying, and that requires profound knowledge of indigenous languages. So let me leave it at this point, and so that we can go into discussion and address any questions that arise. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.